Of mid-April, that means summer is around the corner. We often talk about sunscreen and vitamin D. Today we're talking about some of the ingredients in sunblock. Joining us to talk about it is Dr. Sabrina Fabi. Dr. Fabi, always great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Jen.
All right, first let's talk about the balance between getting enough sun, so you get your vitamin D, which of course we know is important, and then getting too much sun, which we know can lead to not just sunburn, but much more serious conditions.
Right, so all of this has actually been prompted by a study that was recently done in Sweden, where they took women that had had malignant melanoma and followed them and asked them questions about their lifestyle to see if sun exposure habits correlated with the incidence of their melanoma. And what they found was, when asking them all these questions about their lifestyle, was that those that actually had less sun exposure, were basically never out in the sun, but got melanoma, had an increased incidence of mortality, usually associated with cardiovascular disease and other forms of cancer, versus those that reported the most amount of sun actually did not have as high of an incidence of cardiovascular disease and other forms of cancer. So it begs the question, is sun exposure that bad? Now, we know that sun exposure is the #1 cause of skin cancer, which is the number one type of cancer that we see, period. But could this also be causing other types of cancers or other types of morbidities?
Yeah, it's interesting with that study too, because I would think that with the cardiovascular link, it would seem that those who were a little more tan were probably the ones that were outside working out more and therefore had better cardiovascular health.
You're right, absolutely. And so what we start to think about are, obviously everything is multifactorial. You know, there's not always just one thing that leads to something else, as much as we want it to be the case. There's obviously things like our DNA that has an effect, and the other things that we expose ourselves to, whether it's our environment, our food, pollution, etc. And I think it always just promotes, really, you know, everything in moderation. As a dermatologist, I'm always encouraging my patients to really be protecting good sun protective habits, but we recognize vitamin D is important. So then the question becomes, is vitamin D the culprit here? Because basically the women that had no sun exposure, their mortality rate was pretty much equivalent to those that were smoking in this particular study. But again, it was just one study and in Sweden.
Right, I like getting outside with my out sunscreen in the morning before the sun is super intense, and then putting on the sunscreen, which, speaking of, we talked about teasing this, that sunscreen could lead to impacting your fertility. Tell me about that.
Right, and so in the sunblocks that we have, they're pretty much made up of either chemicals or basically mineral-based substances like zinc and titanium dioxide. Many of the chemicals that are in them, like your avobenzones, your oxybenzones, and there's a list of others, have been actually, there was a study where they were screening them. These are actually going to be presented at the Endocrinology 89th annual meeting in Boston that's going to be held pretty soon. And so what they found was that of the 45 different chemicals that we have in these sunscreens, 13 were actually found in the blood of humans. And so when they actually went a step further to try to see if in sperm, if it actually had an effect on sperm motility, they again found that 13 of them did have an effect on sperm motility. And so the more and more we're protecting ourselves from the sun, we have to be cognizant of what we're applying on our skin, because our entire surface area of the skin obviously can be absorbed. I mean, a good amount of these chemicals are being absorbed, so we need to know what's being absorbed.
So then really quickly, you would just recommend mineral-based sunscreen?
Yeah, so for the body, when you have such a large surface area, I always encourage a more mineral-based sunblock. For a small surface area like the face, sunblocks that don't, you know, it's not such an area that's being absorbed so readily. So there, if it has an antioxidant blend, then I'll maybe make an exception. But for the body, when you're covering a large surface area, I do encourage mineral-based sunblocks.
Really good insight. Dr. Fabi, always great to have you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Jen.